The morning Dorothy Redmond's oldest son pressed his face against the wavy glass of the front window and whispered those four words. Her heart stopped beating for exactly 3 seconds before it thundered back to life with the force of a runaway freight train. That is him. But we must go back further than that morning. We must go back to the dust and the grief and the long, lamplit nights when Dorothy first began telling her boys the stories, because the stories are where everything truly began. It was the spring of 1878 when Dorothy Redmond buried her husband, Thomas, in the rocky soil behind their homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas. Thomas had been a good man in most of the ordinary ways. He had built the house with his own hands. He had planted wheat that rose and fell with the unforgiving Kansas seasons, and he had given Dorothy 2 sons. The first was Caleb, who came into the world in 1871 with a shock of dark hair and a pair of eyes that already seemed to be measuring everything they saw. The second was Henry, born in 1874, small and sweet-natured, with his father's wide forehead and a laugh that sounded like water running over smooth stones. Thomas Redmond had died the way so many men died in those years on the Kansas frontier, not from violence or outlaw bullets, but from the slow, grinding cruelty of a fever that started small and built until it consumed everything. He was 31 years old. Dorothy was 27. Caleb was 7. Henry was 3. The debt Thomas left behind was not enormous, but it was real. There was a note held by a man in town named Amos Garrett, who ran the feed store and also, quietly and less publicly, served as something of a lender to the farmers who came up short between harvests. Thomas had borrowed $240 over the course of 3 years, drawing against projected crops that never quite reached their projected yields. Amos Garrett was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense, but he was a practical one, and practical men in that county in that era had a way of making their interests known in ways that settled like a cold weight on a widow's shoulders. Dorothy worked. That is the simplest and most honest thing that can be said about the years following Thomas's death. She worked in ways that would have impressed even the most tireless of her neighbors. She kept the wheat going with the help of a hired hand, a quiet Cherokee man named James Bird, who came through in the planting and harvest seasons and accepted fair wages without ceremony. She took in laundry from the families in town who could afford to pay for it. She grew a kitchen garden that she expanded year by year until it provided enough excess to sell at the market in Caldwell on Saturday mornings. She was not a woman who had come to Kansas expecting softness. She had grown up in Missouri on a small farm with 6 siblings, and a father whose philosophy of life was that hardship was the best teacher and self-pity was a luxury none of them could afford. She had carried that philosophy with her the way other women carried a Bible or a cameo portrait. It was the thing she pressed her hand against in the dark hours. But there were things the philosophy could not entirely reach, and those things lived in the nights after the boys were asleep. In the silence of the house where Thomas's boots still sat beside the door for 6 months after he died because she could not bring herself to move them, Dorothy would sit by the lamp and remember something she had never told her husband, something she was not sure she had ever properly told herself. There had been a man, not in the way that sounds like a betrayal or a scandal. There had been nothing of the kind. It had been a single afternoon, the summer before she married Thomas, when she was 25 and freshly arrived in Kansas with her cousin Margaret and Margaret's husband who were settling near Wichita. There had been a town social, the kind that frontier communities organized with the same determination they brought to everything else, because community was survival and survival required not just wheat and cattle but music and dancing, and the warmth of people pressed together in a schoolhouse with paper lanterns. His name was Gilbert Sutton. She had learned his name the way you learn things at socials, in fragments and pieces passed from one person to another. He was 28, someone said. He had come down from Colorado where he had spent 2 years working cattle on a large operation near Pueblo. He was looking at land here in Kansas, maybe thinking of settling. He had a quiet way of holding himself, not shy exactly, but self-contained, as if he had decided long ago that words were most valuable when they were chosen carefully. He had asked her to dance. She had said yes. They had danced twice, and in the second dance he had said something to her about the way the lamplight was coming through the paper lanterns and making the whole room look like it was burning with a gentle fire, and she had looked up at his face and thought that she had never in her life had a man say something like that to her. Not poetic, exactly, but honest. A man noticing beauty and saying so without embarrassment. They had talked for an hour after the dancing. She had learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that he had lost his father at 15, and had been the man of his family's house ever since, that he loved horses in a way that went beyond utility, that he had once read an entire book about ancient Rome that he had found in an abandoned camp, and had thought about it for months afterward. And then Margaret had come to collect her because they were riding back early, and Dorothy had shaken Gilbert Sutton's hand in farewell, and he had held her hand for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and said that he hoped they would meet again. They never did. 3 months later, she met Thomas Redmond at another social, and Thomas was steady and kind and present in her life in a way that was uncomplicated and good, and she had accepted his proposal at the end of winter, and put the memory of that afternoon away in the place where you put things that were beautiful and finished. But you do not bury things that were beautiful and finished in the same ground where you bury regret. You keep them somewhere else, somewhere with light and air. And so Dorothy kept that afternoon. And in the long dark years after Thomas died, when she was alone and tired in ways that sleep could not fix, she found herself telling the boys stories. It was Caleb who asked first. He was 7 and grieving in the wordless way that children grieve, with sudden fevers of weeping that passed as quickly as they came and left him looking scraped clean and uncertain. He had asked his mother one evening, lying in the rope bed he shared with Henry, to tell him a story about a brave man. Not a fairy tale man, not a king or a wizard. A real man. The kind of man who existed out here on the frontier. Dorothy had sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her son's dark eyes in the lamplight, and had begun, without planning to tell him about a man who was good with horses. A man who had grown up knowing hard things and had not been made small by them. A man who noticed beauty in the world and was not ashamed to say so. A man who had come to Kansas once looking for land and had danced with someone at a social, and had spoken about lamplight and paper lanterns. She never said his name. She told the story without a name, the way you might describe a place by saying the mountains were this color and the river ran this way, without ever giving the place its name on the map. The man in her stories had steady hands and kind eyes, and a way of reading the weather by looking at the horizon that she invented wholesale, but that felt true to the character she was building. She gave him virtues she had observed in that one afternoon and virtues she simply wished for, and over the months and years the character grew in the way that characters do when they are tended by a careful imagination. The boys loved the stories. Caleb loved them in an analytical way. He would ask questions afterward. What did the man do when the creek flooded? How did he handle the horse that would not break? What did he know about tracking? Henry loved the stories the way younger children love things, completely and without reservation, storing them in some interior place where they became part of how he understood what the world could contain. As they grew older, the stories evolved. Dorothy added difficulties for the unnamed man to overcome. She added landscapes, because she had heard enough from travelers and settlers passing through to describe Colorado mountain passes and New Mexico desert and the Oklahoma territory with reasonable conviction. She described the man riding through these places with the same quiet self-possession he had shown at the social. She described him doing good work wherever he went, helping people who needed help, moving on when the work was done. She never said his name. She was not entirely sure why she maintained this particular omission. Partly it was that naming him would make the stories feel too specifically rooted in something real, and she was not ready to explain to her sons that this man was someone she had danced with once, and had never stopped thinking about in the way that you never stop thinking about the note you failed to play correctly, the word you almost said. Partly it was that keeping him unnamed allowed him to remain archetypal, a kind of template for what a man could be, which she felt her boys needed more than they needed a name. Partly, and this was the part she was least willing to examine, it was that naming him would make him real in a different way, and she was afraid of what that meant. Caleb turned 10, then 11, then 12. Henry turned 7, 8, 9. The farm continued. The debt to Amos Garrett was paid down slowly and then, in the good harvest year of 1882, paid in full, which was one of the 3 or 4 moments in those years when Dorothy allowed herself to weep for a reason that was not grief. James Bird continued to come in the seasons, and over time became something closer to a fixture than a hired hand. He was 52 years old when Dorothy first met him, and he had the kind of weathered competence that made age irrelevant to the question of what he could accomplish. He taught Caleb and Henry things about the land and the animals that Dorothy could not have taught them, and she was grateful in a way that went well beyond the wages she paid. The town of Caldwell itself was changing in those years. By 1882, it was a full cattle town at the end of the Kisham Trail, which meant there was money moving through it and noise and occasional violence, and a full complement of saloons and establishments that Dorothy had no business in and avoided with the practicality of a woman who had no energy to waste on judgment. She focused on the market on Saturdays, the church on Sundays, the school in town where both boys were enrolled, and the endless work of the homestead. She was 31 years old in 1882. She was, by the account of every woman in the community who paid attention to such things, still a handsome woman. Several men had made their interest known over the years since Thomas's death, in the careful, coded way that frontier society conducted such business. She had declined each of them with equal courtesy and without a great deal of internal conflict. She was not sure what she was waiting for. She was fairly certain it was not practical. Caleb, at 11, had become the kind of boy who made Dorothy feel that she had done something right in the world, which was not a feeling she took for granted. He was serious in the way that the unnamed man in her stories was serious, not grim but thoughtful, always measuring, always watching. He did his schoolwork with a thoroughness that his teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Phelps, found remarkable. He did his chores without being asked. He had, without Dorothy explicitly intending it, apparently internalized the template of the stories and was constructing himself against it. This was both heartwarming and, in a small way that Dorothy kept to herself, slightly unnerving. The man in the stories was a composite of memory and invention. She was not entirely sure what she had promised her son by way of example. Henry at 8 was still Henry, which is to say he was warm and funny and entirely certain that the world was a place that wanted good things to happen in it. Where Caleb observed, Henry participated. Where Caleb waited, Henry jumped. They were complementary in the way that brothers sometimes are, each filling in the space the other left empty. It was in the fall of 1883 when the story changed. Or rather, when a story that had been building in the world outside Dorothy's homestead arrived at her doorstep, which is what stories that matter tend to do eventually. A man came through Caldwell in early October. He had been on the trail since spring, coming up from Texas, where he had spent 3 years working a cattle operation near San Antonio. Before that, according to the fragments of information that travel the way gossip travels in small towns, which is to say fast and not entirely reliably, he had been in New Mexico and before that in Colorado. He was 36 years old. He had come to Caldwell because he had heard there was land available northeast of town, good flat ground with access to a creek, and he was finally at the point in his life where the idea of land felt more true than the idea of the next horizon. His name was Gilbert Sutton. Dorothy did not know any of this on the morning he rode in. She was at the kitchen table when Caleb pressed his face to the window. She was doing the accounts, the small, careful ledger she kept of income and expenditure, which always required more concentration than the numbers strictly warranted, because the concentration was partly an act of will against the anxiety that the numbers could produce. The morning light was coming in sideways through the window and making the kitchen feel warmer than it was. Caleb had gone to the window because he had heard hoofbeats on the road, which was not unusual. The road past their property carried traffic to and from Caldwell, and the boys were accustomed to riders and wagons, and the occasional cattle drive kicking up dust in the distance. But Caleb stood at the window longer than usual. He stood there long enough that Dorothy looked up from her ledger and said, "What is it?" Caleb did not answer immediately. He kept his face pressed to the glass, and when he spoke his voice had a quality she had never heard in it before. A kind of recognition that had no rational basis and yet was completely certain. "That is him," Caleb said. Dorothy set down her pen. She stood up from the table. She crossed the kitchen floor, which had never seemed so long, and she looked through the window over her son's head at the road outside. There was a man on a gray horse moving at an easy walk along the road. He was wearing a dust-colored coat and a dark hat, and the way he sat in the saddle had the quality of someone who had been on horseback so long that the horse and the man had reached a kind of agreement with each other. He was looking ahead at the road, and then, as if he felt the weight of being watched, he turned his head slightly toward the house. Dorothy could not see his face clearly through the wavy glass. The distance was too great, but something happened in her chest that was entirely unreasonable and entirely real, a kind of turning over like a page. "How would you know?" she said to Caleb, and her voice came out almost steady. Caleb looked up at her. His dark eyes, which had always been measuring eyes, were absolutely certain. "The way he sits on the horse," he said. "You always said the man in the stories rode like the horse was his partner, not his tool." Like they were two parts of the same thought. Dorothy looked back at the window. The man had ridden past now and was just visible as a shape diminishing toward town. "That is just a rider on a road, Caleb," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Caleb, with the specific tone of a boy who is agreeing in order to be respectful while remaining entirely unconvinced. Dorothy went back to the table and sat down. She picked up her pen. She looked at the numbers in the ledger, and they made no sense to her for a good 5 minutes, which was 5 minutes longer than they had ever failed to make sense before. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself that there were dozens of men in and around Caldwell who were good riders, who sat their horses with the ease that came from long years of practice. She told herself that her son had built a mythology around the stories she had told, and that mythology had a tendency to see its hero in every sufficiently promising stranger. She was very convincing with herself. She almost believed it entirely. 3 days later she went to Caldwell for the Saturday market. It was a bright October morning, with the smell of coming cold in the air, and the cottonwoods along the creek showing their gold, in a way that always made Dorothy feel the particular bittersweet beauty of the Kansas fall. She had a wagon loaded with the last of the fall garden production, cabbages and winter squash and dried beans, and both boys were with her, because Henry had been promised a visit to the general store, and Caleb had taken on the habit of helping his mother manage the market stall. They were setting up the stall when Dorothy heard someone talking to James Bird, who had come into town with them that morning on some errand of his own. She looked up because James Bird was a man who spoke rarely enough that his conversation was always notable, and the voice talking to him was a voice she did not recognize. And then she did recognize it, not from recent memory. From the deep archive of memory, from the place where things that were beautiful and finished were kept with light and air. Low and clear, with something in it that was Tennessee and something that was the West and something that was just the particular quality of a man who had spent enough time alone to know how to talk to another person without wasting the moment. She did not look up immediately. She kept her hands busy with the cabbages, aligning them with more precision than they required, and she made herself breathe in and breathe out, and reminded herself that voices could be mistaken just as easily as postures on horseback. "James," she said without turning around, "who are you talking to?" A pause. Then James Bird's voice, even and unhurried as always. "Man looking for the land agent. Gilbert Sutton. Just rode in from Texas." Dorothy set down the cabbage she was holding. She turned around. He was standing 6 feet away, and he was older than she remembered, which was entirely expected since 8 years had passed, and the years on the frontier had a way of carving lines into a face and refining a person down to their essential qualities. His hair was darker than she remembered, but that might have been the shadow of the hat. His eyes, when they found her face, were the same. He did not recognize her yet. Why would he? She had been 25 and he had not known her name for more than an evening. She was 32 now, and the years had changed her too, refining her down to the essential qualities in the way that the frontier refined everyone. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, and started to turn away toward James for directions to the land agent. "Gilbert Sutton," she said. He stopped. He turned back. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man searching through a gallery of memories. "Dorothy," he said, and then a small and genuine smile broke through. "Dorothy from Missouri, the social near Wichita." "That is the one," she said. He took off his hat. It was such a simple, old-fashioned gesture of courtesy that it made her feel, for a startling second, 25 again, standing in a schoolhouse with paper lanterns and the smell of autumn coming through the open windows. "I did not know you were in Caldwell," he said. "I would have, I do not know, prepared something better to say." "You are doing all right so far," she said. Caleb appeared at her elbow. He had come around from behind the stall with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did, and he was looking at Gilbert Sutton with an expression that Dorothy recognized as the expression he wore when he was comparing something to an internal standard. She watched his face complete the calculation. He looked up at his mother, and there was something in his eyes that she could not answer, a question that was also somehow already an answer. "This is my son Caleb," Dorothy said. "Caleb, this is Mr. Gilbert Sutton." Caleb put out his hand with the gravity of a 12-year-old who had decided to be as much of a man as possible. Gilbert Sutton shook it with equal gravity, which was exactly the right response. "And somewhere behind me," Dorothy said, "is my younger son Henry, who is currently trying to convince James Bird to let him look at his pocket knife." "How old?" Gilbert said. "Caleb is 12. Henry is 9. A brief pause. The arithmetic was simple, and Gilbert Sutton had never struck her as slow. He would know the boy's father was gone. Everyone in Caldwell knew everyone's basic history within a week of arrival. "Your husband," he said, and the question was asked with the careful respect of a man who already suspected the answer. 5 years ago," she said. "Fever," he nodded. Not with the excessive sympathy that she had learned to dread, the particular kind that made her feel like a figure of tragedy rather than a living woman managing her life. Just a nod that acknowledged the weight of it and did not perform more than that. "I am sorry for your loss," he said. Simple, true, done. "Thank you," she said. Henry arrived at that point, pocket knife inspection apparently concluded, and introduced himself with a cheerfulness that required no encouragement. He shook Gilbert Sutton's hand and asked him immediately whether he had ridden all the way from Texas, and whether he had seen any longhorns on the trail, and whether it was true that the Kishom Trail was getting crowded now because of all the barbed wire going in. Gilbert Sutton answered all 3 questions with full attention and no condescension, and Henry was won over in approximately 90 seconds, which was not surprising because Henry was won over by any person who took him seriously, but also was significant because Henry was, despite his warmth, a good judge of character in the intuitive way that some children are. "I need to find the land agent," Gilbert said, addressing himself to Dorothy again. But I wonder if you are here for the market today, whether you might have time later for coffee. There is a place on Main Street." "I know it," she said. "If it is not too forward," he said. "It is not too forward," she said. 2 o'clock. "The market winds down by then." He smiled again and put his hat back on and went to find the land agent, and Dorothy turned back to her cabbages. Caleb appeared beside her. "I knew," he said quietly. "You recognized a man on a horse from 100 yards through wavy glass," she said. "Do not let it go to your head." "Yes, ma'am," he said. This time the tone was different. It held something very close to happiness. The 2 o'clock meeting at the coffee house on Main Street lasted until 4, which was longer than Dorothy had planned for, and which required her to send Caleb back to the wagon with Henry to wait. A request that Caleb received with the composure of a 12-year-old who understood exactly what was happening and had already decided it was good. She and Gilbert Sutton sat across from each other at a small table with their coffee, and talked in the way that people talk when they are catching up on 8 years of separate lives, but also discovering that the conversation they had started at that social near Wichita had never entirely stopped in some interior sense, only been interrupted. He told her about Colorado. The cattle operation near Pueblo had been good work and hard work, and had given him skills he was grateful for. But the man who owned the operation had been difficult in ways that Gilbert described carefully, not bitterly, which she noted. He told her about New Mexico, where he had spent 2 years as part of a small outfit driving cattle between ranches, and about the landscape there, the red and ochre, and the way the sky in New Mexico had a depth of blue that seemed almost unreal. He told her about Texas and the San Antonio operation, which had been the most stable and well-run place he had worked, with a foreman named Eduardo Reyes who had taught him more about cattle in 3 years than he had learned in the previous 10 combined. She told him about Caleb and Henry, which was a large part of her life, and she did not apologize for that. She told him about the farm, about the debt that was now paid, about the market garden. She told him about James Bird with genuine warmth and gratitude. She told him about Caldwell, about the cattle drives coming through, about the way the town had grown and continued to grow, and what that meant for someone trying to farm on its outskirts. She did not tell him about the stories. Not yet. He had found the land agent that morning and had been shown a parcel of land northeast of Caldwell that seemed to be almost exactly what he had described wanting. The agent had offered to take him out to look at it Monday morning. "If it is what he says it is," Gilbert said, "I am going to want to move quickly." "The land around Caldwell is going fast," Dorothy said. "The trail drives bring money and money brings people and people want land." "How do you feel about that?" he said. "The growth of the town." It was a question that assumed she had a considered opinion, which she appreciated enormously because not everyone did. "Mixed," she said honestly. "More people means more market buyers, and that is good for my garden. It also means more pressure on the water and more noise and more of the things that come with cattle towns. The saloons." "The saloons," he said, with a kind of dry acknowledgement of a whole category of frontier reality. "My husband never went to them," she said. "I do not judge all men by the ones who do, but I notice." "Fair enough," he said. "Do you?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "I have a drink sometimes when it is hot and the work is done," he said. "I have never gambled money I could not afford to lose, and I have never been the kind of man who makes himself trouble with whiskey, but I am not going to lie and say I have never set foot in a saloon." "That is an honest answer," she said. "I thought you would prefer that to a pious one," he said. "Considerably," she said. The afternoon light was coming gold through the coffee house windows by the time they stood to leave. They walked out onto Main Street, which was doing its Saturday business with the particular energy of a cattle town on a fall afternoon. Drovers moving through, merchants busy, horses tied 3 deep at the hitching posts, the distant sound of something musical drifting from one of the establishments down the street. "I hope the land is right," she said. "So do I," he said. And then with a directness that was simply part of how he was made, "I was glad to run into James Bird this morning." "Were you?" she said. "I had been thinking since I decided on Kansas about that social," he said. "About a conversation I never finished." "It was 8 years ago," she said. "Conversations end." "Some of them," he said. Caleb and Henry were visible down the street, sitting on the wagon seat. Henry was talking animatedly, and Caleb was listening with the particular patience he extended to his brother. Dorothy raised her hand to them, and Caleb raised his hand back. "You're boys," Gilbert said. "My whole heart," she said, without thinking about it, and then was glad she had said it because it was true and he should know it. Anyone who was going to be in her orbit should know it. "Of course," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that sounded like a man calculating difficulty. It sounded like a man accepting truth. He tipped his hat to her and walked toward the livery stable where his gray horse was stabled, and Dorothy walked toward her wagon and her boys. "Well," said Henry, unable to contain himself even for the amount of time it took her to climb up onto the wagon seat. "Well, nothing," she said. "We are going home." "Mama," said Henry. "He is looking at land Monday," said Caleb, who apparently had been watching the street with more attention than his posture had suggested. "Means he might stay." "That is between him and the land agent," Dorothy said, picking up the reins. "Yes, ma'am," said Caleb, and the tone was the one that meant he was letting her have the fiction while remaining entirely clear-eyed about the substance. Dorothy drove them home through the gold October afternoon and did not say anything else about Gilbert Sutton, and the silence felt less like the silence of nothing happening and more like the silence before music begins, the moment when everyone has taken their places and the instruments are ready and the first note is about to be played. The land was right. Gilbert Sutton came to that conclusion on Monday afternoon when he stood on the northeast parcel and looked across the flat ground at the way the creek bent through the far edge of the property, and felt something settle in him like a stone, finding the bottom of clear water. He had been moving for nearly 20 years. He had been good at moving. He had learned things in every place he had been, and he was grateful for all of it, but he was 36 years old, and the idea of moving felt, for the first time, like a loss rather than a gain. He signed the papers at the land agent's office before the week was out. He paid the first installment from the money he had saved in Texas, which was enough to secure the transaction and leave him enough to begin the work of establishing himself. The work of establishing himself meant lumber and labor, and the 100 decisions that go into building a structure on empty land. He was not a man who needed help with the physical work, but he was a new man in a new place, and the practical necessity of community made itself felt. He went to the hardware store and the feed store and the lumber yard. He talked to the men he met there with the same directness he brought to everything, and within 2 weeks he had a rough sense of who in and around Caldwell was reliable and who was not. He encountered Dorothy again at the Saturday market, then again the following Saturday. They developed, without formally arranging it, the habit of coffee in the afternoon when the market wound down. These conversations went deeper and further each time, the way conversations do when the foundation under them is genuine. He told her things he had not told many people, about his father dying when he was 15 and how that had shaped him, about the years when he had been angry in a way he could not explain, and how the physical work of the frontier had given the anger somewhere useful to go. She told him things she had not said aloud to anyone in a long time, about the particular loneliness of being a widow on a frontier homestead, about the pride she felt in the farm and the boys, and about the fear that lived underneath the pride, which was that any single bad season could undo what she had built. He listened to everything she said with full attention. Not the performative listening of a man doing what he thought was required, but the real listening of a man who was genuinely interested in the person in front of him. Caleb and Henry became part of these Saturday afternoons by a process of gradual inclusion that felt natural rather than engineered. Henry had immediately decided that Gilbert Sutton was excellent and proceeded to share this opinion freely. Caleb took longer, which was characteristic of Caleb. He watched Gilbert Sutton with those measuring eyes over several weeks, and what he was measuring, Dorothy gradually understood, was not whether Gilbert was a good man in the abstract, but whether he was the man from the stories in the specific. The moment she understood this fully was on a Saturday afternoon in late November when Gilbert was showing Caleb some aspect of his gray horse's harness, explaining the differences between the various styles of bit and their appropriate uses for different horses and different terrain. Caleb was listening with the total absorption he brought to anything that genuinely interested him, and Gilbert was explaining with the patience of a man who respected the capacity of his audience. There was nothing performed about it, nothing that felt like a man trying to impress a child in order to impress the child's mother. It was just a man sharing what he knew because someone wanted to know it. Dorothy watched from across the market square and felt, with a clarity that was both simple and devastating, that she was in very serious trouble. She was falling in love with Gilbert Sutton. She had perhaps never entirely stopped falling in love with Gilbert Sutton. The afternoon at the social near Wichita 8 years ago had started something that had been kept alive in the particular way that things are kept alive when they have no outlet, by being tended in private, by being shaped into stories and told to children in lamplight. The fact that the man had arrived after all of that and was exactly what the stories had said he was, or rather, was a real human being of sufficient substance that the stories had not been wrong in their essential character, was the kind of thing that Dorothy did not have a framework for. She had a practical framework for almost everything. Debt and harvest and fever and loneliness, and the specific grief of burying a husband in rocky soil behind the house. She did not have a framework for the feeling that was sitting in her chest watching Gilbert Sutton show her son how to properly care for a horse. She decided she would need to build one. The building of it took through November and into December, which was fine because December brought its own complicated weather, and the business of preparing the homestead for winter and Christmas preparations that were modest, but which the boys anticipated with full-hearted enthusiasm. Gilbert's land was progressing. He had the frame of a house up and the walls nearly complete, and was working through the brutal December cold with a determination that impressed even the most seasoned of the men who had stopped to look and occasionally to help. He was the kind of man that other men helped not because they were obligated to, but because his competence was apparent and his gratitude was genuine, and there was something about the project that felt like the right kind of thing happening. Dorothy brought him food twice during those weeks. She told herself it was neighborly. He was a man alone working in the cold, and there was nothing remarkable about a neighbor bringing hot food to someone building a homestead in December. This was the frontier, and that was how the frontier worked. The first time she brought food, a pot of soup and a loaf of bread, he thanked her with the kind of thorough and uncomplicated gratitude that made her feel the gesture had been received exactly as it was intended. They stood in the frame of his unfinished house, with the cold Kansas wind coming through the open spaces, where the windows would be, and talked for half an hour about the construction, about the winter, about what he planned to do with the land come spring. The second time she brought food, Caleb came with her because he had asked, and she had said yes, and then wondered if she was already doing the thing she was trying not to do, which was weaving these lives together before she was sure about anything. But Caleb, standing in the unfinished house with Gilbert Sutton, listening to the explanation of how the roof joists were laid and why, looking up at the gray December sky through the open roof, with an expression of pure engaged interest, made her feel that the weaving was happening regardless of what she intended, and that perhaps the question was not whether but how and with what care. It was on an evening in January 1884 that the stories became part of the real conversation. The boys were in bed. Dorothy was not entirely sure how Gilbert had come to be sitting in her kitchen at 7 in the evening. It had developed through a sequence of practical occasions, A question about a property boundary that required the survey papers she held copies of. A discussion about whether the creek on his land was likely to flood in spring. The kind of conversation that begins with purpose and ends with someone saying, "Since you are here, there is coffee." The boys had been up and had talked with Gilbert about their day at school, Henry volubly and Caleb with the composed brevity he brought to reports of his own activities, and then Dorothy had sent them to bed, and she and Gilbert had stayed at the kitchen table with their coffee in the lamplight, and the night outside the window was cold and clear and full of stars. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "That is not about fencing or drainage." "You can try," she said. "Your boys," he said. "They are extraordinary, both of them in different ways, and I have been thinking about what made them that way. I do not think it is just your husband's influence, since Caleb was 7 when he died and Henry barely remembers him, and I do not think it is just the farm and the work, though I am sure that is part of it." He paused, and she did not say anything because she could tell he was getting somewhere. "Caleb said something to me last week," Gilbert said. "He said that I reminded him of someone. I asked who, and he looked at me with that look of his, you know, the one, and said, 'The man in the stories.' I asked what stories, and he said his mother's stories. And then he stopped talking, which seemed intentional." Dorothy looked at her coffee cup. "Ah," she said. "You have been telling them stories about a man," Gilbert said. "A real one, from what Caleb implied, not a made-up one." "Parts of him were made up," she said carefully. "The circumstances mostly, the landscape, things I had no way to know. But the character," he said. "The character," she said, "was based on an afternoon at a social near Wichita in the summer of 1875. The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp made its small, steady light. Outside, the January night pressed against the windows. You never told your husband," he said. "There was nothing to tell," she said. "Thomas was a good man. There was no betrayal in it. It was one afternoon. You barely knew my name." "I knew your name," he said quietly. "I thought about you that fall. I asked Margaret's husband the following year if he knew where your family had settled. He had lost touch with your cousin by then. I did not know how to find you." Dorothy looked up from the coffee cup. "You asked after me," she said. "And then I heard you had married a farmer outside Caldwell," he said, "and I thought, well, that is how it is, and I went to Colorado." She did not say anything for a moment. She was doing the accounting of years, of paths taken and paths not taken, of the particular way that two people can orbit each other through time without finding the intersection point until the world decides they have waited long enough. "I told my boys stories about you for 5 years," she said. "I never used your name. I gave them a man with your quality of attention and your way with horses and what I could remember of your character from a single afternoon, and I filled in the rest as best I could." He was watching her with the same full attention he brought to everything, and in the lamplight his eyes were doing something complicated. "And was I as good as the stories?" he said. "You are better," she said, and her voice was absolutely even, which cost her something. "The stories had to be invented around a frame. You are the whole building." Gilbert Sutton sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Dorothy." "Yes," she said. "I am going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly because I am too old to manage anything else." "All right," she said. "Are you open to the possibility of this?" he said. "Not of what it might become eventually, not of any particular arrangement. Just of exploring whether this is what I think it is." "And what do you think it is?" she said. "I think it is what it was at that social 8 years ago," he said, "except that now we are older and there is real ground under us instead of a schoolhouse floor, and there are 2 remarkable boys in the next room who have apparently been expecting me." Dorothy laughed at that, and the laugh was real and warm and surprised her, and he smiled when he heard it, the full smile this time, the one that changed everything in his face. "I am open to the possibility," she said. "Yes." "Good," he said. They had another cup of coffee, and talked for another hour about things that were ordinary and things that mattered and several things that were both simultaneously. When he left, he stood at the kitchen door with his coat on and his hat in his hands, and he said good night with the directness of a man who was not performing anything, and she said good night back, and after the door closed, she stood in the kitchen for a long minute listening to the sound of his horse moving away down the road. She went to the window and looked out at the winter stars and thought about the years of lamplit stories, and the unnamed man and her sons growing up measuring themselves against a template. And she thought about the way that some things take a very long time and arrive exactly when they are supposed to. The winter moved forward. The conversations continued, both the formal ones at the coffee house on Saturday afternoons and the informal ones that evolved from practical occasions. He came to dinner one Sunday and Caleb and Henry were entirely different versions of their usual selves. Henry more electric and Caleb more watchful, and Dorothy made a roast and biscuits, and the kitchen was warm and Gilbert Sutton sat at the table where Thomas Redmond had once sat, and the world was different and also somehow continuous. After dinner, Caleb said without preamble or apology, "My mother never told us your name." Gilbert looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at Caleb. "No," she said, "I did not." "Why not?" Henry said. "Because," Dorothy said carefully, "I did not want the stories to be specifically about any real person. I wanted them to be about a quality of character." "But it was specifically about him," Caleb said, indicating Gilbert with a slight tilt of his head. "Caleb," Dorothy said. "No," Gilbert said with a small smile, "let him. He is right and he knows he is right, and he is going to keep being right whether we acknowledge it or not. That is clearly just how he is." Caleb looked at Gilbert Sutton with an expression that was as close to warmth as his composed face tended to come. "Yes, sir," he said. "Your mother told you about a man she had met once," Gilbert said to both boys, "because she had been impressed by him and because she wanted you to know that kind of man existed. She could not have known we would end up in the same town. That is not a planned thing. It is just the way the world works sometimes." "Do you believe in that?" Henry said with the directness of a 9-year-old. "In what?" "In the world working things out," Henry said. Gilbert considered this with genuine seriousness. "I believe that if you do your work and keep your character honest, you tend to end up where you are supposed to be," he said. "Whether that is the world working things out or just you working things out, I'm not sure there is a difference." Henry thought about this. "That is a good answer," he said. "Thank you," Gilbert said. The spring of 1884 arrived in the way that Kansas springs always arrived, suddenly and with conviction, the cold breaking overnight and the ground softening and the smell of things beginning coming up from the earth. Gilbert's house was finished by the end of February and was a good solid structure, better built than most of what was going up in those years, because he had taken the time to do things right and had the skills to know what right looked like. Dorothy came to see it on a bright March afternoon, both boys in tow, and walked through the rooms with the appraising eye of someone who had built her own practical life and recognized quality work when she saw it. The kitchen was well designed with good cabinet work. The main room had a fireplace that drew properly. The 2 bedrooms were soundly constructed. There was a barn in progress and already housing his gray horse and a second horse he had acquired over the winter. "It is a good house," she said. "It needs some things," he said. "It needs curtains," she said. "Among other things," he said, and looked at her with something in his eyes that she had learned to read by then, which was the look of a man who had an opinion about the future and was exercising patience with himself about when to express it. She had her own opinion about the future. She had been building it carefully over the winter, constructing it the same way she had constructed the stories in the dark years, from the inside out, testing each element for structural integrity before adding the next. What she had built, by March of 1884, was the clear and settled conviction that she was in love with Gilbert Sutton in the complete way that she had not been in love with anyone since, and possibly including the girl she had been at the social in 1875. This love had the quality of something that had been growing for a long time in conditions that were not quite right, the way a root survives in hard soil, and had now found better soil and was putting out growth with a thoroughness that she found both wonderful and slightly terrifying. The terrifying part was about the boys, not because she worried about Gilbert with her boys. She had watched him carefully over those months with the specific attention of a mother, and she had seen nothing that frightened her. He was consistent, which was perhaps the most important thing. He was the same man on a cold Tuesday afternoon helping Caleb repair a fence as he was on a Sunday dinner with everyone watching. His patience was not performance. His interest in the boys was not strategic. He had a particular gift with Henry, matching the boys' enthusiasm without being condescending, and an equally particular gift with Caleb, which was the gift of treating him as a person whose serious thoughts deserved serious responses. The terrifying part was about loss. She had loved a man and buried him and built 5 years of life on top of the grief, and the prospect of opening the full architecture of her heart to someone again required a courage that she had to actively summon rather than simply find lying ready to hand. She summoned it on a Saturday afternoon in April, when the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first green, and the air smelled of everything beginning. They were walking along the creek bank after the market had wound down, which had become a regular addition to the Saturday afternoon ritual. The boys were ahead of them, Henry splashing at the edge of the water and Caleb watching Henry with a combination of exasperation and affection. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said. "I am not afraid of feeling what I feel," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not a woman who mistakes caution for wisdom. I have been careful about this because it matters enormously and not because I am uncertain." "And now," he said. "Now I am not uncertain," she said. He stopped walking. They were standing on the creek bank with the sound of the water and the cottonwood leaves and Henry's distant shout of discovery at something he had found in the shallows. "Dorothy," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been in love with you since the summer of 1875, he said. "I want to say that plainly because I am tired of not saying it. I thought about you for months after that social. I thought about you as a might have been for years after I heard you had married. When I decided to come to Kansas, and I told myself it was the land and the grass and the trail and all of it was true, but somewhere in it there was also the fact that you were here, and I knew that because I had asked again just before I left Texas. I knew you were a widow. I knew you had 2 boys and a farm. I did not come to Kansas because of that, but I did not pretend that information was nothing." The creek moved past them with its spring fullness. Henry found something and held it up, shining wet, shouting for Caleb to come look. "You came back to the right county," she said. "I would like," he said, "to ask you to marry me. I would like to ask you that now. Not because it is the expected thing or the practical thing, but because I want to build my life with you and your boys, and I am very certain of it." She looked at his face in the April light, the lines that the years had put there, the steadiness in his eyes that had been there the first time she saw them. "Yes," she said. "But I need you to ask the boys." He looked over at Caleb and Henry on the creek bank. "Now," he said. "Yes," she said. He walked to them. She stayed where she was and watched. He called to them and they both came, Henry at a run and Caleb at his usual measured pace. He crouched down to be level with them, which was the gesture of a man who understood something fundamental about respect, and he spoke to them for several minutes. She could not hear the words over the water. She watched Caleb's face go through several calculations in rapid succession and arrive at something that was unmistakably relief. She watched Henry's face go directly to joy without passing through any intermediate stage. Henry threw his arms around Gilbert Sutton's neck with the total commitment of a 9-year-old who has decided a thing, and Gilbert caught him and held on, and over Henry's shoulder his eyes found Dorothy's. Caleb put out his hand. Gilbert took it. They were married in June of 1884 in the small white church on the edge of Caldwell that had been built the previous year and still smelled faintly of new lumber. It was not a large ceremony. Dorothy was not a woman who required spectacle, and Gilbert was not a man who wanted it. There were a dozen people who mattered to them, including James Bird, who sat in the front pew in the good coat that Dorothy had never seen him wear before and looked at the whole proceeding with the quiet approval of a man who has watched someone he respects arrive at something they deserve. Mrs. Alina Phelps was there because she had been Caleb and Henry's teacher for 3 years and had watched Dorothy manage the impossible with grace. Amos Garrett was there, the man whose debt Dorothy had paid down year by year and year, because Dorothy had decided that holding grudges against practical men for being practical was not a productive use of her emotional energy, and because he had, in fact, extended genuine courtesies over the years that she had not forgotten. Caleb stood at Gilbert's left. Henry stood at Dorothy's right. The minister, a young man from Ohio named Reverend Thomas Clayton, conducted the ceremony with a sincerity that made up for his inexperience. And when he got to the part where he spoke about 2 lives becoming one, Dorothy felt Gilbert's hand tighten slightly over hers, not in nervousness but in emphasis, as if he wanted to be sure she felt the moment as fully as he did. She did. After the ceremony, there was a dinner at the farm, which had been prepared with the collective effort of the women of the community in the way that frontier communities prepared such things, as a shared project that was both practical and an expression of belonging. There was food enough for twice the company, and the afternoon lasted into the evening, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing on the flat ground beside the house. Gilbert danced with Dorothy the way he had danced with her at the social 9 years earlier, with the same quality of attention, as if the dancing was not incidental to something else but was itself something worth doing fully. She thought about paper lanterns and said so. "I remember what I said about them," he said. "So do I," she said, word for word. "What did I say?" he said. "You said it looked like the room was burning with a gentle fire," she said. He looked at her in the evening light of the Kansas June. "I was probably trying to impress you," he said. "It worked," she said. "Good," he said, and smiled. Henry danced with Mrs. Alina Phelps, who submitted gamely to being the partner of a 9-year-old with more enthusiasm than coordination. Caleb did not dance but stood watching with his hands in his pockets and an expression that, for him, was positively beaming. James Bird played cards with Amos Garrett at the table near the house, and occasionally looked up at the dancing with the air of a man who was satisfied with the current state of the world. Dorothy looked across the party at Gilbert laughing at something Henry had done, a full, unguarded laugh that she had been seeing more of in the past months, and that she loved with a specificity that she could have described down to its individual components, and she felt, in the way that you feel things when you are not braced for them, entirely and completely happy. The happiness was not simple. Nothing true is. It had Thomas in it, the memory of Thomas and the debt she would always feel she owed to the years they had been good together and the sons they had made together. It had the 5 hard years in it, the debt and the frost and the fever of loneliness. It had Caleb's face at the window saying that is him, which she would carry for the rest of her life as one of the moments that the world had spoken most clearly. But it was happiness, real and present and entirely hers. The summer of 1884 was good. The crops were strong. Gilbert's land, planted with his first real crop under his own management, produced better than his most optimistic projection, which was the result of the kind of systematic preparation he had brought to everything he had done in those months. He and Dorothy worked alongside each other in the way that frontier couples worked, which was to say constantly and in full partnership, each bringing their own competence and each augmenting the others. He was good with the horses in the way she had described in the stories, which still sometimes caught her with a small internal start of recognition. He did move through the world with a quality of attention that was neither anxious nor careless but settled, watchful in the way of a man who had learned to read landscapes both literal and human. He was patient with Henry's endless questions and with Caleb's more occasional but more searching ones. He was, Dorothy reflected one August morning watching him explain to Caleb why a particular fence post needed to be set at a specific depth, almost exactly what she had promised her sons. She had told him this one evening in September, in the kitchen after the boys were in bed. She had told him the full shape of the stories, the content that she had glossed over in the first telling, all the details she had invented and all the fragments she had remembered, and how the two had woven together over the years into something that had been, she understood now, a kind of preparation. He had listened to all of it. "You told them stories about a man you met once," he said, "and then you spent 8 years turning them into the kind of man you needed." "I told them stories about the man I thought you were," she said, "and then I hoped I had been right." "Were you?" he said. She thought about it genuinely because he deserved a genuine answer. "You are more complicated than the stories," she said. "Real people always are, but the quality is the same, the essential thing I was trying to describe. Yes, I was right." He looked at her with the full attention that had not diminished at all over the months of marriage, which was something she had noticed and was grateful for. "You took a significant risk with those boys," he said. "What if I had ridden in and turned out to be a disappointment?" "I thought about that," she said. "I decided that the qualities I was describing were worth aspiring to regardless of whether any particular man embodied them. If you had ridden in and been someone other than what I hoped, the stories would still have given them a model. The model does not require the man to be real." "But it is better when he is," Gilbert said. "Considerably," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the kitchen with the lamp making its small, steady light, and the autumn night outside the window, and the whole of their life together still mostly ahead of them. The fall of 1884 brought the kind of weather that tested everything. There were early frosts in September that damaged some of the late crops, and there was a stretch of October that brought cold rain almost continuously. Gilbert handled the difficulties with the even competence that she had come to rely on in the way you rely on the reliability of a good foundation. He did not catastrophize, and he did not pretend things were better than they were. He assessed the damage, recalculated, and made the adjustments required. Caleb worked alongside him through the difficult weeks, and Dorothy watched her son absorbing something that went beyond the practical knowledge of how to handle a flooded field or a damaged crop. He was absorbing a way of being in relation to difficulty, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a mother who sees her child being taught by someone she trusts. Henry absorbed it differently, as Henry absorbed everything, which was by talking about it. He narrated the whole crisis of the fall weather to anyone who would listen, including Mrs. Eleanor Phelps, who apparently found his detailed agricultural analysis charming. He came home from school one November day and reported that Mrs. Phelps had asked him to give an account of the seasonal challenges to the whole class, which he had apparently done with great thoroughness. "She said I was thorough," Henry said, with the satisfaction of a boy who had received an assessment he considered accurate. "You are thorough," Gilbert said, "among other things." "What else am I?" Henry said. "You are good company," Gilbert said, "which is not as common as people assume." Henry beamed. The winter of 1884 into 1885 settled in firmly, and the homestead became the kind of small enclosed world that frontier winters created. The family gathered around the warmth of hearth and routine, moving between the house and the barn in the cold, and finding the interior life rich enough to sustain the season. Gilbert read in the evenings, which Dorothy had not expected and was delighted by. He had accumulated a small collection of books over the years of travel, carried in a worn leather satchel that had come with him from Tennessee, and he had added to the collection at the general store when the chance arose. He and Caleb had taken to reading the same books and discussing them afterward, a development that Caleb clearly found almost impossibly satisfying. They would sit on either side of the fireplace in the evenings and argue about things they had read with the careful mutual respect of two people who disagreed, but wanted to understand each other. Dorothy would sit with her mending and listen to them and feel something she could not fully name, which was the feeling of a family being built in real time, of the mortar setting between the stones. Henry would be in bed by 8 and would shout down objections to various points being made in the literary discussion, until Dorothy told him firmly that he had exhausted his participation credit for the evening. Gilbert would tell him to get some rest because tomorrow's argument would be waiting. Henry would subside. By spring of 1885, Caleb was 14 and Henry was 10, and the shifts that age produced in both of them were becoming visible. Caleb was growing into his height, and his seriousness was taking on a more adult quality. He had begun to talk in the evenings about what he wanted to do with his life, and the conversations were substantive enough that Dorothy felt she was talking to someone who was becoming his own person in earnest. He wanted land. He wanted to farm, which was both the simplest and the most profound thing he could have said, given the life he had been raised in. But he also wanted, he said, to know more about the law of land, about how property worked and what rights a man had and what protections the law offered, because he had grown up watching his mother navigate the realities of being a widow with a debt and a homestead in a county where practical men made practical decisions, and the law did not always move quickly in favor of people who needed it. Dorothy and Gilbert both listened to this carefully. "There is a lawyer in Caldwell named Horace Webb," Gilbert said, "who I have dealt with on the property matter. He is an honest man and a good lawyer. When you are 16, if you want to approach him about reading law in his office, I will speak to him on your behalf." Caleb received this with the particular look he reserved for things that mattered enormously. "Thank you," he said, and meant it as fully as two words can mean anything. "You would have to keep up with the farm work," Dorothy said. "I know," Caleb said. "That is not a condition I am reluctant to meet," she said, and reached across the table and pressed her hand briefly to his, which was the kind of physical expression of feeling that she allowed herself more often now, as if Gilbert's presence had made the house warmer in ways that went beyond the fireplace. Spring of 1885 also brought news that spread through the county the way news spread, in layers of rumor and confirmation and discussion. The railroad was extending toward Caldwell from the north, which would change everything about the economy of the region. The cattle trail that had defined Caldwell for 15 years was already in decline because of the barbed wire fencing being strung across the open range, and the railroad would complete the transformation of what the town was and what the county could be. Gilbert had been thinking about this since arriving. He had discussions about it at the Saturday market and at the feed store and occasionally at the coffee house with men who had been in the county long enough to have opinions about its direction. He was not a man who could stand to be passive in relation to a major shift in his environment. He thought about what the railroad meant for his land, for his crops, for the kind of farming he could sustain. He had a conversation with Dorothy in May of 1885 that she considered one of the most genuinely equal conversations she had ever had with another person. He laid out his thinking. The railroad would make it possible to ship grain to the eastern markets with a reliability and volume that was currently impossible. It would also bring new settlers who would need things, goods and services, and the town would grow in ways that created opportunities but also pressures. The pressure on water would be significant. The land prices would rise, which was good for what they held and potentially difficult if they needed to expand. He proposed that they think about consolidating the two properties, combining the management of her homestead and his parcel into a single operation, which would be more efficient and which would be positioned better for the changes coming. He said he had talked to Horace Webb about the legal aspects of how this could be done properly so that Dorothy's ownership interest was protected, not absorbed. "I want to be clear about this," he said. "I do not want to suggest that because we are married your land is now my land. It is not. I want a formal legal arrangement that protects your interest in the boy's inheritance." Dorothy looked at him across the kitchen table. "Gilbert Sutton," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are an unusual man," she said. "I have been called worse," he said. "I mean it as the highest possible compliment," she said. They went to Horace Webb's office the following week and had the arrangement drawn up properly. Webb, who was indeed a good lawyer and an honest one, handled the matter with efficiency and a quiet approval that he did not entirely hide. Dorothy walked out of that office with a legal document that specified her ownership interest and her son's inheritance rights with more clarity and more protection than she had before. And she walked next to Gilbert, who had insisted on this at his own legal expense. And she thought that the person she had described in the stories had been, after all, not an invention but a prediction. The summer of 1885 was the best growing season since Dorothy had come to Kansas. The combined operation produced more than either had managed separately, which was the practical argument for consolidation, and the work was distributed between more capable hands, which was the human argument. James Bird continued to come in the seasons and had extended something like grandfatherly approval to the new arrangement. He had said to Dorothy one morning in August, while they were working alongside each other on the fall plantings, in his characteristically minimal way, "Good man." "Yes," Dorothy said. "Boys know it," James said. "They do," Dorothy said. "You know it for a long time," James said, not as an accusation but as an observation, and went back to work. Dorothy went back to work too, but carried the observation with her for the rest of the day. It was in November of 1885 that Dorothy realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told Gilbert, not out of uncertainty about how he would receive it but because she wanted the knowing to be hers for a little while first. She was 34. This was not young to be expecting, though neither was it unusual for the time and place. She felt the mix of things you feel when you are carrying a child and you are a person who understands fully what the experience contains, the wonder and the weight and the specific vulnerability of it. She told him on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen after the boys were in bed. He was very still for a moment when she told him. She watched his face move through something private and then arrive at something clear and open. "Are you well?" he said first. "Yes," she said. "I feel fine." "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need you to not be frightened," she said, "because if you are frightened I will become frightened." "I am not frightened," he said. He reached across and took her face in both his hands with the greatest care, the way you hold something that is irreplaceable. "I am extraordinarily happy." She leaned into his hands for a moment and felt something she recognized as the particular relief of being held by someone who means it. The boys received the news at Sunday dinner with responses entirely consistent with their characters. Henry erupted in immediate excitement, announcing that he hoped for a brother, then revising to say he would also accept a sister but a brother would be his first choice. And could the baby sleep in their room, and would Gilbert teach the baby about horses, and when exactly? Caleb was quieter. He waited until after dinner, when Gilbert was helping Henry with something in the barn, and came and sat down at the kitchen table where Dorothy was clearing the dishes. "Mama," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. She set down the plate she was holding and turned to look at her oldest son, 14 years old, with Thomas's eyes and some quality of soul that was entirely his own, and she thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I am completely and entirely happy." He nodded. "Good," he said. The measured tone was exactly as it always was, but there was something behind it that she recognized, which was the face of a child who has been anxious about something for a long time and has received an answer that releases the anxiety. He had been worried, she realized, that the new child would change things for him and Henry, that the arrival of Gilbert's biological child would shift the balance of belonging. She sat down at the table with him. "Caleb," she said, "you and Henry are Gilbert's sons as much as any child I carry. He told me that himself, early on in those words. I believed him and I believe him now, and I expect you have seen enough of him to believe it too." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I have seen enough," he said. "Then trust it," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time the tone was the one she loved most, the tone of the boy doing what the man he was becoming would do, which was to accept what was true and build on it. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was long and cold, one of the hard Kansas winters that tested every structure and every person within it. Gilbert had prepared the house and the barn with thoroughness, and the preparations proved their value as the cold deepened through January into a severity that the oldest residents of the county said they had not seen in years. The pipes in some of the less prepared houses in town froze. A family 3 miles east lost a portion of their livestock in a blizzard that came through in February. Gilbert and Caleb kept the livestock safe by a combination of good preparation and vigilant attention during the worst of the storms. There were 3 nights when Gilbert slept in the barn, to be certain. There was one night when Caleb, at 14, asked to stay with him, and Gilbert had considered it and said yes, because the asking was the right asking. The asking of a boy who wanted to do real work in a hard situation, and the answer Gilbert gave acknowledged that. Dorothy was in her 7th month by February, and she managed the winter with the practical fortitude that was her characteristic mode, though she accepted help more readily than she once had, which she recognized as a form of wisdom. She let Henry bring the wood in. She let Caleb take over the heavy water carrying. She accepted the help Gilbert offered with the ease of someone who had learned that accepting help from people who love you is not weakness, but a way of honoring the love. The baby arrived in March of 1886, at the end of a late winter storm that had one last expression of cold fury to offer the county before retreating. Dorothy's labor was attended by the midwife, a capable woman named Ruth Holder, who had delivered half the babies in the county over the past decade, and who handled the whole business with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this was both profession and calling. The baby was a boy. Gilbert, who had been in the main room with Caleb and Henry through the long hours of the labor, came into the bedroom when Ruth Holder called him, and Dorothy held up the baby, and he stood looking at his son for a long moment with the precise and specific expression of a man encountering something that he did not have adequate words for but was determined to meet fully. He sat down on the edge of the bed, and Dorothy put the baby in his arms. He held the baby the way you hold a baby when it is the first time and you are not certain you know how, with careful, deliberate attention to getting it right. Then something settled in him, and he held the baby the way you hold a baby when you have found the right way, with confidence and gentleness combined. "What is his name?" Caleb said from the doorway. Dorothy looked at Gilbert. "We decided on Thomas," she said. "Thomas James." Caleb was very still for a moment. Thomas for his father. James for James Bird, who had been the quiet, dependable support of their family through all the years before Gilbert arrived. "That is a good name," Henry said, from behind Caleb in the doorway. "Come in," Gilbert said, and both boys came into the room, and the 5 of them occupied the same small, warm space in the lamplight while the last of the winter storm blew itself out against the window, and Dorothy looked at the faces of her family, all 4 of them, and felt the world complete itself in some essential way. Ruth Holder came back in to check on the baby and made several professional observations that were satisfactory, and accepted the payment Dorothy had arranged, and departed into the thinning storm with the efficiency of her trade. James Bird, who had come by during the night to check on things in the way he had, heard the news on the front porch from Caleb, and stood for a moment with his hat in his hands and said, "Thomas James," and nodded once, and that nod contained more feeling than a longer response would have. The spring of 1886 came in behind the storm with unusual gentleness, as if the world was offering a compensation. The planting season was ideal, warm and wet in the right proportions, and the combined operation that Dorothy and Gilbert had built was positioned to take full advantage of it. The railroad had reached the county, and the connection to eastern markets was real now rather than theoretical, and Gilbert's assessment of what that meant proved accurate in the first season of its availability. The harvest that year was the best the land had seen in a decade. Dorothy stood at the edge of the wheat field in August and looked at the stands of grain that had come up full and strong, and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has bet on themselves and the land and been proven right. Young Thomas, who would be called Tom by everyone from the beginning, was a robust and settled baby who slept with an enthusiasm that his parents found both welcome and slightly comic after the more wakeful babyhood that Caleb and Henry had each provided. He was, from the beginning, adored by his older brothers with a completeness that settled Dorothy's quiet worry about jealousy before it had time to establish itself. Henry in particular was devoted in the way that 10-year-olds can be devoted to a baby, with a total and uncomplicated tenderness that made him seem briefly older than he was and simultaneously more himself. He held Tom at every opportunity. He spoke to him in the particular voice that people use with babies, warmer and slower than their ordinary voice, and Tom watched Henry's face with the focused attention of someone learning the world one interesting thing at a time. Caleb was more private about his feelings, as he was about most things, but Dorothy noticed that he always went to look at Tom in the mornings before his other business, and that when he held his youngest brother, there was something in his face that was as close to naked feeling as Caleb's controlled exterior usually permitted. The summer of 1886 ended well and the fall was kind, and by the time winter settled in again, the household had found the rhythm that makes a family feel like something that was always going to be, rather than something assembled from circumstances. Gilbert had the conversation with Caleb about Horace Webb's office in October of 1886, when Caleb was 15 and beginning to plan the year when he would be ready to ask. Webb had expressed willingness to consider a reading student when the time came, and the path was clear. Caleb received this with the composure that was his signature and went directly back to the farm work. But Dorothy, watching his face in profile as he returned to the barn, saw the quality of light in it that the stories had been trying to describe all along, which was the quality of a person who knows where they are going. The years built on themselves in the way that good years do, each one adding to the structure of the life rather than testing its foundations. Tom walked at 11 months and talked at 14, and had, by the time he was 2, the kind of decisive personality that made everyone suspect he was going to be an interesting person to raise. He combined Henry's warmth with Caleb's observational quality and added something that was entirely his own, which was a thoroughgoing interest in how things worked, expressed by a dedication to taking apart every object that came within his reach. Dorothy's and Gilbert's marriage deepened in the way that real marriages deepen, not by becoming grander but by becoming more true, the superficial layers worn away by the daily reality of two people working and living and raising children together, leaving the essential core of each person visible to the other. Gilbert knew Dorothy's impatience when the accounts were difficult, and her specific quality of joy when the kitchen garden was at its peak in August. Dorothy knew Gilbert's silence when something was worrying him, and the particular way he walked when he was solving a problem in his mind. They knew each other's dreams and their specific flavors of fear, and the things that made each of them laugh without warning. They argued sometimes, as people who are genuinely themselves in each other's presence must. The arguments were about real things and were conducted with the mutual respect of two people who had each arrived at themselves through hard experience and were not willing to pretend otherwise. They always found their way back from the arguments to the ground that was solid between them, and Dorothy noticed that the finding back was never labored or resentful. It was just two people returning to the place where they both lived. In the spring of 1888, Dorothy discovered she was expecting again. She was 37, which was older, and she and Gilbert talked about it with the full honesty that they brought to important things, acknowledging the additional risk without catastrophizing. Ruth Holder was still in the county, still delivering babies with her characteristic efficiency, and she assessed Dorothy and gave her assessment in the matter-of-fact terms that Dorothy preferred. "You are strong and you know what you are doing," Ruth said. "Take care of yourself and come to me if anything does not feel right." Dorothy took care of herself and came to Ruth in November of 1888 when the baby arrived, another boy, who was named after Gilbert's father, whose name had been David. David Gilbert Sutton came into the world with a full set of lungs and an immediate opinion about the temperature of the room, which he expressed at length. "This one will be noisy," Ruth Holder said, with professional prediction. She was right. David was the loudest person in a household that had always had its share of noise, partly because Henry was constitutionally incapable of quiet and Tom had developed into someone who expressed all of his considerable opinions vocally. But David had a quality of vocal intensity that made all previous noise seem, in retrospect, moderate. Gilbert held his second son on the first evening and looked at Dorothy over the baby's head with an expression that was composed of exhaustion and absolute joy in equal parts. "He is extraordinary," Gilbert said. "He is extremely loud," Dorothy said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," Gilbert said. Caleb was 17 by the time David was born. He was, by then, reading law in Horace Webb's office 2 afternoons a week, and the rest of the time was the most competent farmer in the operation, which Gilbert acknowledged without any awkwardness because Gilbert's relationship with his own competence was healthy enough that other people's competence did not threaten it. Henry was 14 and had decided, with the characteristic completeness of his decisions, that he wanted to be a teacher. This had been decided after spending a significant amount of time with Mrs. Eleanor Phelps over the years, not because he had a crush on his teacher, as the teasing of his peers occasionally suggested, but because he genuinely found the transmission of knowledge to be one of the more interesting things a person could do. He had taken to tutoring the younger children in the county when the opportunity arose, and had a gift for it that Dorothy recognized as the same gift he had always had, which was the gift of making other people feel that what they wanted to understand was interesting, and that they were entirely capable of understanding it. Tom was 2 and noisy and delightful. David was a baby and noisier still. The house Gilbert had built had been extended by then, a second bedroom added and the kitchen enlarged, and it had the look of a place that had been built by someone who planned to stay and had been added to by someone who was glad they had. It had curtains, which Dorothy had made in the first month of their marriage and which she had replaced twice since when they wore out, and a kitchen garden visible through the front window that was her particular pride, larger now than it had been in the days when it was the financial supplement to a widow's strained household economy. Now it was a garden she tended for the love of it as much as the practical value. In 1889, when Caleb was 18 and had been reading law for 3 years, Horace Webb offered him a position in the office. Not yet as a lawyer, the bar was some years off, but as a legal clerk with real responsibilities and a real wage. Caleb came home with this news on a Friday evening and presented it at dinner with the controlled composure that was his way and the barely visible quality of happiness that those who knew him best could read accurately. Gilbert said, "Congratulations," and shook his hand across the table. Dorothy said, "Your father would have been so proud," and meant Thomas Redmond, the farmer in the rocky soil who had given her this son. And she saw Caleb receive the words, and she was glad she had said them because Thomas deserved to be part of this moment and Caleb deserved to know it. "He was a good man," Caleb said, which was more than he usually said about his father, and Dorothy understood that it had taken all 18 years for him to arrive at that statement, not because Thomas had not been good, but because the years of growing up had given Caleb the full scope needed to understand what goodness in a limited and human way actually meant. Henry, 14 and enthusiastic, announced that when Caleb became a real lawyer, he was going to have him write up an official document stating that Henry was the best brother ever. Caleb said he would take that under advisement. Tom, 2 years old, banged his spoon on the table in what everyone chose to interpret as approval. By the fall of 1889, the household had the quality of a thing fully made. The 2 farms combined into one operation. The fields that had once been Dorothy's widow's ground and Gilbert's new settlers' hope, now a single expanse of productive land that provided well for everyone within it. The house full and warm. The kitchen garden in its fall harvest. James Bird coming in the season's end as he always had, moving through the work with the same unhurried competence, now 63 years old and slightly slower, but not in any way that mattered. Dorothy was 38. Gilbert was 42. They sat on the porch in the October evenings when the work was done, and the younger children were in bed, and the older boys were at their own occupations, and they looked at the Kansas sky with its impossible depth of stars, and talked the way people talk when they know each other all the way down, and are not afraid of what they find there. "Do you remember," Dorothy said one October evening, "what I told you about the first time I saw you riding past the house?" "Through the wavy window," he said, "and Caleb said that is him." "I was standing in the kitchen," she said, "and my heart stopped. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself it was just a rider on a road." "Were you convincing?" he said. "Briefly," she said, "for about 5 minutes." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the night air was cold and clear and full of the smell of the season turning. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The afternoon I rode past your house," he said. "I was on my way to look at the land agent's office. I had been riding since first light. I was tired. And then I rode past your house, and there was something about it, some quality of the place, the way the kitchen garden was laid out, the look of the fencing, the care of it. And I thought, someone lives very fully in this house. And I kept riding, but I thought about that house all the way into town." Dorothy was quiet. "You told me you had asked about me before you came to Kansas," she said. "You knew I was in Caldwell." "I knew you were in Caldwell," he said. "I did not know which house was yours. When I rode past that morning I did not know. I just noticed the house." "And then you ran into James Bird," she said. "And then I ran into James Bird," he said. "And he told you my name," she said. "And I turned around," Gilbert said, "and there you were." The stars above the Kansas prairie were very bright. The coyotes were somewhere in the distance making their particular sound that was part of the landscape as essentially as the grass and the sky. Somewhere in the house Tom made a sound in his sleep and then was quiet again. 14 years, Dorothy said, from the social to that morning. "Some things take a long time," he said. "And then they arrive all at once," she said. "And then they arrive all at once," he said. She listened to the night for a while. She thought about the lamplit evenings and the stories she had told, the unnamed man with the steady hands and the quality of attention and the way he sat a horse. She thought about Caleb pressing his face to the wavy glass and saying those 4 certain words. She thought about the coffee house on Main Street and the creek bank in April, and the January kitchen, where Gilbert had told her he had been in love with her since 1875. She thought about Thomas in the rocky soil, and the debt paid down year by year, and James Bird coming with his unhurried competence in all the seasons of the hard years. She thought about Caleb growing into his seriousness, and Henry growing into his warmth, and Tom with his decisive personality, and David loud and extraordinary in his cradle. She thought about the legal document in Horace Webb's office that protected her ownership and her son's inheritance, and the man who had insisted on it. She thought about all of it, and it arranged itself in her mind not as a sequence of events but as a whole, a single complete thing, the way a landscape looks from a sufficient height, with all its complications visible but resolved into a shape that makes sense. "Gilbert," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, "in the full and complete way. Not the might-have-been way. I loved the idea of you when I was telling the stories. The real way. The way that knows you, including the parts that are difficult, and loves you more for the knowing." He held her closer and she felt his breath against her hair. "Dorothy," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have loved you since you looked up at me in a schoolhouse full of paper lanterns and thought I was saying something worth hearing," he said. "I have been building toward you my whole life without knowing it. Everything I learned in Colorado and New Mexico and Texas, every hard thing that shaped me. It was all in preparation for being the man that you needed. I understand that now." She was not going to cry. She had not cried at the wedding, and she had not cried when he held Tom for the first time, and she was not going to cry now on the porch in October with the stars above the prairie and the whole of her life good and present around her. She cried anyway, not with grief, which was its own familiar country, but with the overwhelming gratitude of a person who has been given what they needed and has the wisdom to recognize it. He held her and did not say anything else for a while, which was exactly right, because he was a man who knew when words were enough and when they were not necessary. The coyotes called again in the distance. The stars went on being bright. The house behind them held their children, all four of them in their various qualities of sleep. Caleb with his law papers and his clear future. Henry with his plans for teaching and his undiminished warmth. Tom with his decisive personality and his 2-year-old's absolute trust in the world's interest in him. David with his extraordinary lungs temporarily quiet. And James Bird's wage paid and fair as it had always been, and the legal document protecting what was theirs, and the land solid under the house that Gilbert had built with good lumber and careful joinery, the house that had had curtains within a month of their marriage. Dorothy pressed her face against Gilbert's shoulder and breathed in the smell of him, which was the smell of the land and the work and something that was entirely his own, and thought, "This is the ending of the stories and the beginning of the life, and there is no distance between them at all." They sat on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and then they went inside to the warm kitchen with the lamp making its small steady light, and Gilbert put the bar across the door against the night, and Dorothy checked on the boys as she always did last thing, 4 of them now in their 2 rooms, and she stood in the doorway of each room and listened to the sound of breathing and felt the world exactly as it was. Complete. Full. Hers. She came back to the kitchen and Gilbert was there with 2 cups of coffee, which was a small thing and was everything. "Thank you," she said. He smiled, the full smile that changed everything in his face. "Always," he said. She sat down across from him at the table where the accounts had been, where she had set down her pen the morning Caleb looked through the wavy glass and said those 4 certain words, and she picked up her coffee cup, and outside the October night was full of stars, and inside the lamp burned steady, and this was the life she had built and been given and chosen, and it was entirely and completely enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. The winter came and went. The spring came back. The land was good. The boys grew. The stories were over because the story was real, and the real story was better than any version she had ever told by lamplight, and she never needed to leave the name out again.